In his 1983 epitaph to industrial culture, music journalist John Savage described industrial music as an intervention into the dialogue between avant-garde and pop music. Industrial music arose out of the factory refuse of a suddenly and viciously commercialized punk rock. The revolutionary fervor of punk lost its power and gave way to the eternal droning of a machinic noise, an index for the society of control. Scholars typically trace the genealogy of industrial to the Italian futurist movement. Catalyzed by Filippo Marinetti's call to arms in 1909, the futurists looked for beauty in progress, and its heralds industry, speed, and war. Futurist composers rejected traditional constraints like the 12-tone system and conventions of melody and harmony. Instead, they built acoustic noise-making machines called intonora mori. There were several varieties of these machines, but they all used unconventional methods to emulate or recreate the sounds of industrial machinery, which defined the soundscape of early 20th century Europe. The forward momentum of futurism staggered during World War II. Marinetti and other futurists aligned themselves with the progressive vision of fascism. Their support dwindled once they ended up on the wrong side of history. The German experimental rock group Kraftwerk represents an important step between futurism and industrial music. They helped rescue the techno-optimist aesthetics that were tainted by National Socialism, and introduced industrial sounds into non-academic electronic music. Kraftwerk's successors watched industrial areas decay during the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s. The first industrial artists were much more cynical about technology, progress, and movement. In industrial music, movement became circular and repetitive, progress became meaningless, and technology a force of social and psychological discipline and control. The authors William Burroughs and Brian Gysin are both key influences as well. Not only were they personal friends and mentors of Genesis P. Orridge, lead vocalist of Throbbing Gristle, who's going to become important later on, but in their writing they developed philosophies of control, as well as methods for emancipation that would become relevant for industrial, like the cut-up technique, which is utilized for musical composition in the form of tape loops and sampling. By cutting up and rearranging words on a page, Burroughs intended to bypass grammatical constructs imposed on the human mind by external forces. This can be seen at work in music in the form of glitches and circuit bending. According to industrial scholar S. Alexander Reed,
by challenging the capacity of the machine to operate, musicians bypass having to question whether their own reinterpretations and appropriations of technology are merely part of an even larger hidden control mechanism.
After this, the web of influence becomes increasingly complex. Amid a cultural wasteland, the diverse collection of fiercely independent first-generation industrialists showed no fidelity to genre, medium, or discipline in how they cite their influences. Artistic movements like Dada and concrete music are frequently referenced. There's also experimental rock bands like the Velvet Underground, the Mothers of Invention, Captain Beefheart. Artists like SPK draw from post-structuralism and the work of Carl Jung, while Genesis P. Orridge was heavily invested in occultism and the work of Aleister Crowley, as well as William Burroughs. Because the logic of the machine that inspired the futurists had been disenchanted, and its influence more thoroughly interrogated, it became necessary to explore this machine logic across mediums, with a critical ambivalence and, importantly, an eye toward the human body and embodied experience. John Savage helpfully outlines 5 ideas that underlie industrial culture: organizational autonomy, access to information, extra musical elements, the use of synthesizers and anti-music, and shock tactics. Organizational autonomy is the ethos of DIY culture that's communicated through both ideological language and common production trends. Access to information is important because industrial artists saw themselves fighting an information war, which is William Burroughs' term for the central political social struggle of the 20th century. Counter-information, including literature and commentary on philosophy and social theory, was often disseminated through extra musical elements. Despite that, it was the music that bridged the gap between the intellectual avant-garde and popular audiences that needed to hear the message. Music was employed explicitly as a persuasive force in the information war. The use of synthesizers and anti-music characterizes the sound of industrial music, but only comprises part of a wider variety of tactics by which industrial artists attracted an audience while attacking the aesthetic conventions of both pop and art music. The final principle is shock tactics, which serve not only to gain attention and generate buzz, but as a means to shock audiences out of accustomed habits. I'll use these principles to structure my analysis of how industrial artists engage simultaneously in radical artistic and entrepreneurial practices. 1. Organizational autonomy. The principle of organizational autonomy emerged to address several practical concerns, like funding niche, often deliberately inaccessible music projects, and exercising control over artistic expression. At the same time, maintaining autonomy was an ethos appeal to the community's anti-authority and anti-capitalist sentiments. It's also an incentive to innovate and move past what Savage calls the tainted and unnecessary model of major label distribution. Common DIY tactics included self-production, self-distribution, and using self-made, found, pawned, or stolen instruments. This was encouraged through the scene's DIY discourse, grounded not so much in working-class solidarity, as was the case with punk music, but in a philosophical understanding of the possibilities of artistic creation, freed from the mutually reinforcing constraints of conventional aesthetics and global capital flow. These sorts of economic aesthetic tactics can be traced to the Fluxus movement, who attempted to desacralize and demonetize art through mass production, establishing a worldwide network of flux shops and flux mail order warehouses. By most accounts, the first industrial band was Throbbing Gristle, and their independent record label, Industrial Records, became the genre's namesake. Throbbing Gristle can be understood both as a band and as one stage in an evolving and branching series of radical performance art groups. It was composed of bassist and vocalist Genesis P. Orridge, guitarist and vocalist Cozy Fanny Tutti, tape manipulator and graphic designer Peter Christofferson, and synthesist and sound/light technician Chris Carter. They first met as members of the music and performance art group Coom Transmissions, and Throbbing Gristle itself would eventually split into the video/music group Psychic TV and the band Chris and Cozy, among other side projects. Like many of their peers, Throbbing Gristle operated according to an effectual logic, rather than a causal logic. That is, rather than determine a goal and then set out to attain the resources to accomplish it, they took amateurism and DIYism as axiomatic and explored possible effects. At this point, I should clarify, in 2003, P. Orridge and spouse Jacqueline Breyer began the Pandragine Project, intending to apply literary cut-up techniques to their own bodies in an effort to liberate consciousness from gender identity and from the individualized body. Through a combination of behavioral mimicry and surgical modification, they became identical aspects of the same person, taking the shared surname Breyer P. Orridge and using plural pronouns, which in English happen to be the same as non-binary pronouns. Following Reed's work, I maintain the masculine singular pronoun when referring to Genesis P. Orridge before the advent of this project, both for clarity and in the spirit of the project as a performative invention, rather than a correction or discovery of the self. Anyway, given their confrontational and evidently unmarketable artistic output, Throbbing Gristle put their existing skills and resources to work founding Industrial Records. S. Alexander Reed writes that,
through hard-earned connections in governmental arts councils, the entertainment business, and post-hippie subculture, Throbbing Gristle's members organized a financial support system that allowed them, shortly after their official formation, to launch the label.
Throbbing Gristle started production on their debut full-length album, Second Annual Report, in 1977, using inexpensive, largely secondhand or obsolete equipment. For Throbbing Gristle and the industrial movement at large, such an entrepreneurial DIY approach was not just necessary, but desirable for its counter-aesthetic and counter-economic effects. Mark Derry observes that industrial artists are
engaged in the inherently political activity of expropriating technology from the scientists and CEOs, policymakers and opinion shapers, who have traditionally determined the applications, availability, and evolution of the devices that more and more shape our lives.
On the aesthetic motivations, Peorage explained that the band wanted the recording
to be unprecious in every way, except the information implicit in material and in our choice of sound, and its rarity as an object.
These entrepreneurial tactics, then, in addition to affording artists emancipatory control of their artwork and organization, themselves acted as a persuasive force, an economic argument and mobilization against the dominant neoliberal order and popular aesthetic paradigms, and an argument for the consumption of art and music outside traditional channels. This argument resulted, however briefly, in the construction of an art world that operated according to a different set of rules, an organizational line of attack on existing economic material practices. Through their distribution and production practices, Industrial Records and other independent labels in the scene employed counter-economic rhetoric to divert flows of capital away from major labels and to a close-knit community of like-minded artists. 2. Access to information and extra-musical elements. Aside from the economic rhetoric of entrepreneurship and DIY, Throbbing Gristle and Industrial Records codified what would become the archetypal image and aesthetic rhetorical tactics of industrial music. These tactics were first and foremost invested in what Burroughs called the information war. For Throbbing Gristle, music was a means to a greater end, and that end was revealing and combating the control machines that influenced thought and behavior. Industrial artists adopted a guerrilla strategy in the information war. They eschewed conventional ways of distributing information, which is in itself a strategic move, as these conventions are informed by the systems that they hope to undermine. Album liner notes became a means of pointing listeners to theorists, writers, spiritualists, and other artists, which they may not have encountered otherwise. This practice was exemplified by the French record label Sordide Sentimental, who issued records by a diverse selection of artists, including Throbbing Gristle and other acts like Joy Division, packaged with artwork and philosophical texts, encouraging critical, intellectual, as well as aesthetic engagement. The label's co-founder, Yves von Bonty, who authored many of these texts, discusses the importance of the enthymeme as a rhetorical technique and a mode of reasoning.
When I am writing, most of the time I try to stop in the middle of a sentence, just to try to oblige people to continue the sentence with their own imagination, and to work with the meaning. I hate people only wanting to receive, who don't want to give anything, who don't want to participate.
The band Nurse with Wound offers another example of the variety of information that might be disseminated. In the packaging of their first 2 releases, they included a list of musical influences, now known as the Nurse with Wound list. These range from contemporaries like Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire to canonical predecessors like Velvet Underground and John Cage, as well as a collection of virtually unknown artists. To adapt Deleuze and Guattari's terminology, we might call this a minor musicology that carves out a space for countercultural practice. For Throbbing Gristle and Genesis Peorage in particular, language itself serves an important function in shaping thought, an idea that's supported in the cognitive sciences. Following his hero and mentor William Burroughs, Peorage sought ways to undermine linguistic processes in order to liberate thought and expression from the social institutions that influenced language. In an essay on Burroughs and Geison's cut-up method, he writes,
In culture, the cut-up is still a modification of, or alternate language. It can reveal, describe, and measure control. The aim is a reclamation of self-determination, conscious and unconscious, to the individual. The result is to neutralize and challenge the essence of social control.
When writing, Peorage uses a system of unconventional spelling and terminology that he developed throughout his career. For instance, if you read the passage that I just quoted, you'd notice the word "the" is spelled with 2 E's. Christopher Partridge writes that these and other odd spellings and grammatical constructions
Are intended to challenge thought and ways of reading. They provide a challenge to the ways in which we have learned to think. Our angle of vision is bent during the process of reading. Words are given, Peorage argues, added levels of meaning.
This is the rhetorical technique of defamiliarization, which was first articulated when Aristotle observed that
To deviate from the prevailing usage makes language seem more elevated. As a result, one should make the language unfamiliar.
Defamiliarization involves the manipulation of language in order to cast a familiar concept in a new way. These and Peorage's other unconventional and suggestive spellings play with signifying chains, evoking new connotations between words and allowing for new affective resonances. The, spelled with 2 E's, is an antiquated but intimate way to address someone or any noun. In place of realize, he writes real eyes, as in true vision. This casts cognitive understanding as a material sensory phenomenon. Of course, these are only subjective readings of deliberately open-ended language play, and by ascribing them particular meanings, I defeat the purpose, which is to allow connotations to proliferate and therefore bypass built-in interpretation and return control of language to the reader and the writer. 3. Anti-music. Operating in tandem with their organizational attack, industrial artists hoped to incite an aesthetic revolution with their music. Industrial music contains an incredible stylistic diversity, owing to its investment in individuality and local expression. The importance of locality to what would so quickly become a global phenomenon is best understood as artists reacting to localized manifestations of globalized forces in similarly localized ways. The shadow of World War II, the cultural tensions of the Cold War, and the expanding hegemony of neoliberalism all loomed over a plurality of post-industrial landscapes. But each landscape bore unique scars on its own cultural body, and therefore facilitated its own types of industrial expression. This can be felt and heard sonically, with artists sampling the material and cultural artifacts that surrounded them, as well as singing or speaking or yelling, largely in their local dialect. There's few places where this localism is better expressed than in the music of another seminal industrial band, Einstürzende Neubauten. Hailing from Berlin, Einstürzende Neubauten was incubated in a complex post-war cultural environment. State-enforced guilt, foreign occupation, and a war-torn cityscape clashed with a vibrant artistic community bolstered by inexpensive housing, strong squatting communities, as well as robust arts initiatives meant to compete with Soviet East Germany. Neubauten's defining musical characteristic is their reliance on found objects for percussion and texture, a practice that reportedly originated with squatters pounding out rhythms on the city's metal barricades during standoffs with police. Their sound was built from the detritus of the city itself, scraping and hammering on metal beams, shattering glass, beating a shopping cart across a stage with a metal rod, etc. Many of these instruments were found or stolen from the city's streets and construction sites. More complicated instruments were built from similarly found and stolen materials. The overall effect is highly material. That is, it manifests in a real context and signifies not through symbols or abstractions, but through the physical resonant property of the artifacts themselves. In this case, resonant means both sonically resonant and resonating with people, having a moving effect. Berlin's political importance during and after World War II in many ways vastly overshadowed its real existence. Carolyn Birdsall notes that,
for commentators past and present, Berlin is often an abstraction, an idea or a surface as much as a lived material city.
Neubauten's percussive soundscapes do not symbolize Berlin, and their music does not evoke Berlin. The soundscape is Berlin, and the music berates the listener with the material resonance of the city itself, cutting through symbolic abstraction. Einstürzende Neubauten's raw sonic material rhetoric can be contrasted with the synthesized and manipulated music of Throbbing Gristle, who are more interested in the physical force of sound as material. Their shows were often so loud that it caused the audience physical pain, an effect that's augmented by the strange mechanical noises that comprise the content of this sonic barrage. At sufficiently high volumes and sufficiently low frequencies, the vibrational force that sound exerts on the body has disorienting and defamiliarizing effects. Auditory, tactile, proprioceptive, and visual inputs slightly contradict each other, as sound literally moves and changes physical space at a molecular level. Extreme sound has been shown to induce stress and motion sickness, and to interrupt cognitive processes. A handout from Throbbing Gristle's 1976 debut performance reads,
Imagine walking down blurred streets of havoc, post-civilization, stray dogs eating refuse, wind creeping across tendrils. It's 1984. The only reality is waiting, mortal. It's the Death Factory Society, hypnotic mechanical grinding, music of hopelessness, film music to cover the Holocaust, tantra of the subliminal, word falling, photo falling, and a nostalgia for feeling totally sterile, endless tribal music. The tribe of mutations, street gangs lobotomized in the Death Factory. It never ends. TV children trying to prepare themselves, meditating on, cease to exist.
On top of disorienting and stress-inducing blasts of sound, Throbbing Gristle incorporates evocative, parataxic linguistic depictions and disturbing imagery to surround the listener in a dystopian landscape, which then becomes the locus of their anxiety. Audiences are quoted as finding the performance powerful and difficult, attesting to the effect of the experience and perhaps pointing to a new and more skeptical view of the post-industrial world around them. 4. Shock tactics. The label of shock rock has been applied to popular artists from Screamin' Jay Hawkins in the 50s to contemporary industrial rock acts like Marilyn Manson and Rammstein. The shock tactics of early industrial musicians like Throbbing Gristle, however, are more closely linked with the radical performance art movements of the 1960s and 70s, particularly Fluxus and the controversial antics of the Viennese actionists, both of whom profoundly influenced Throbbing Gristle in their early work as Coombe Transmissions. Whereas Fluxus was influential for the anti-art aesthetic and business model, the group was attracted to the actionists for their use of shocking performance art to confront people's repression and attack the consensus morality of their society. The two sentiments were gradually reconciled with a series of performance and conceptual art pieces that took place at the transition point between Coombe Transmissions and Throbbing Gristle in 1976. The focal point was an infamous exhibition titled Prostitution. In an essay published in the art journal Studio International, the band asserted that guitarist Cozy Fanny Tootie's past work as a pornographic model was, in fact, performance art. It was all a calculated and covert attempt to disseminate en masse what was, according to authorial intent, actually artistic nudes. They argued that the exhibit was the culmination of a Fluxus-inspired effort to destroy the value of art. To drive home the message, these photographs were then cut out from the magazines and framed in a gallery. This exhibit, titled Prostitution, sparked moral outrage, leading Member of Parliament Nicholas Fairbairn to famously label the group as wreckers of civilization. Over 100 newspaper and magazine articles were published discussing the exhibition and its fallout. As the final stage of the project, cuttings from these articles were likewise framed and exhibited alongside the nudes. The combined final product was intended to display, on one hand, the prostitution of artists who operate under the funding and control of public institutions, and therefore, at least according to media discourse, must serve the interests of the state and abide by popular morality. On the other hand, it highlights the literal prostitution that artists often resort to in order to sustain their artistic careers, all while challenging notions of high versus low art. It's also worth noting that, as Tootie attests in her autobiography, the exhibition allowed her to reclaim her body and reconcile her financially motivated modeling work with her artistic ambitions. Most pertinently, however, this exhibit functioned as a test for strategies of rhetorical circulation, the guerrilla manufacturing of fine art through pornographic magazines, as well as the group's quickness to seize on the flurry of media coverage, which soon turned Genesis P-Orridge and Cozy Fanny Tootie into very unlikely household names. This all illustrates ways in which semiotic meanings and rhetorical effects change as artifacts are reproduced, as they transform and move through their environments. As a result of this test, Coombe Transmissions was able to recognize the limitations of state and institutional support. In fact, the gallery that exhibited them soon lost state funding as a result of the controversy. So the group's next step was to harness the power of the spectacle through a mode that would both reach more people and provide a more sustainable income. That mode is, of course, pop music. Throbbing Gristle did not make an effort to top the prostitution exhibit in extremity and grotesqueness. They come to understand the dynamics of the information war better than the actionists or Fluxus. Their project was not to intensify qualitatively, but to expand quantitatively. Shock tactics became an essential part of industrial music's vocabulary. They constituted both a means of psychic liberation from conventional cultural codes and, to quote Savage again,
a time-honored technique to make sure what you have to say gets noticed.
Some of these techniques were very familiar. Throbbing Gristle and many other industrial acts subverted totalitarian and fascist imagery in a vein not dissimilar to early punk's appropriation of the swastika, as a guerrilla semiotics that sought to strategically disrupt the link between the signifier and the signified. Whereas for punks, this was motivated by a profound nihilism and perpetual edginess. Industrial artists played with new associations and provoked their audience to think critically about the media messages they encounter. For instance, Industrial Records' logo could easily be mistaken for a generic image of an English industrial town, were it not for the liner notes on their releases, specifying that it is in fact a photograph of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Throbbing Gristle and following bands garnered both attraction via controversy and retention via their radical, subversive brands. In industrial music, it is impossible to separate what a cynic might call publicity stunts from this avant-garde aesthetic and emancipatory political beliefs.